When the college basketball season started, Nick Smith Jr. was projected as the college basketball player likely to be taken highest in the 2023 NBA draft. But a different SEC player took college basketball by storm. How on earth did Brandon Miller become the nation's highest scoring freshman and rise to a top 5 draft pick?
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey there, welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, the only daily national college hoop show out there. Yes, even in the offseason, we're coming at you 5 days a week. I'm Isaac Shade, and back is our guy, Leaf Tulane, right over there. It's so good to see you, brother. I know everyone's tired of hearing me and Andy every day, and they're glad to have your voice back. Coming up on today's show, several things. We want to look at what I'm calling a little Charles Dickens conversation, a tale of two teams. And then we're going to talk about why the ratings were so low for the national championship game. But first, one of the things we want to do is start looking at NBA draft prospects. You might or might not know that our guy Leaf is part of the Locked On NBA Big Boards team. And so they're looking at these draft prospects all the time. And so one of the things we want to do is just each week with Leaf on Thursdays, have a conversation about one of the NBA draft prospects, specifically college players. So we can hear, we've seen them all season long on the college basketball side of things, but what does the NBA think about them? So Leaf, as we sit here on Thursday, April 6th, we're about 2.5 months away from the NBA draft on June 22nd, if I remember correctly. And with that in mind, I want to start looking ahead. And Leaf, no place to start like right at the top. As I said, at the beginning of the season, it was the Wemby show and Scoot Henderson. And then a lot of people were looking at Nick Smith Jr. of Arkansas right after that, obviously injuries and stuff. And we'll talk about him. But today, we want to start with the college player who's risen to kind of take Nick Smith Jr.'s place, and that's Brandon Miller. Leaf, what did this young man do to rise to being what it seems like to me from all the draft boards I've seen is a consensus top 5 pick?
Yeah, I think the NBA's model is very heavy on size, versatility, and shooting, and he hits all of those parameters in a surplus. Personally, and I may have gotten lucky, I just watched him at the end of when I was watching some high schoolers. He went to a less big school than a guy like Dariq Whitehead, who was at Montverde, and a few of the, and like Jerace Walker went to IMG. So you see those guys, and they're on your radar. But I saw Brandon Miller a little later, and I couldn't unsee that he was like Paul George. So wow. I started him pretty high on my list, and yet he still rose. I had him number 4 preseason, and now he's number 3 on my big board. So not a tremendous rise, but there's only so much you can rise when you start that high. But Brandon Miller was the best player on the best team throughout college basketball this year. Alabama didn't win the national championship, and I'm aware that UConn beat Alabama, but I don't think it's crazy to say that Alabama from start to finish was probably the most consistent and most dominant team, as they played in a good conference in the SEC, and they were the number 1 overall seed in college basketball. And even though March Madness is phenomenal, it doesn't always dictate who's the best team. So I think his evaluation is pretty straightforward. It's, do you believe that he can be a top option on a team? And most teams will dictate yes, because he's got great creation ability, defends. He also averaged 8 rebounds and nearly 20 points a game. And I'm not sure that people talk about his passing enough. And that was what Drew Ray reviews in the tournament, in which he struggled shooting the ball, but he was still able to impact the game positively by being a good facilitator and team defender.
Well, let's go to that, Leaf, because that's one of the things I wanted to ask you about. I think a lot of people look at his tournament performance and just go to the points, right? Because that's the thing. Up until that game where he had a goose egg, was that the first? Yeah, that was their first NCAA tournament game against Corpus Christi. Prior to that, he'd only had one single-digit scoring game all season. That's when and Houston held him to 9 points, and understandably so. But he had 19 against Maryland, fine, whatever, and then 9 against San Diego State. It feels like that's a little overblown that what so many, I think Andy and I talked about some of that on the show. Like Brandon Miller had an awful tournament, and it wasn't up to his standards from a scoring standpoint, but like you said, there were other things he did really well as well. So does the lack of scoring performance in the NCAA tournament, will that have any effect on his stock?
I don't think it will. I think the only concern would be that creating like less separation would concern scouts, but I don't think that was an issue. I think he just missed shots. And if you look at an entire season of roughly 35 games, he was able to create space very, very well and shoot a high percentage with on-ball creation, not just like off the bounce. And while I'd rather him score his average in a tournament, which every year some player is going to have an underwhelming tournament that gets the ton of focus from the defense. He was still able to play his game and impact the game by being a decoy, by defending, by rebounding. While I'd rather him score 19, 20 points than shoot 3 of 19 against San Diego State, I still was impressed by his facilitation. I was still impressed by his rebounding and maturity against one of the oldest teams in college basketball that was exceedingly physical. So I don't think
made it to the national championship game, by the way.
Exactly. and I don't think many evaluators are really going to knock him for it. I don't think anyone's going to be like, well, because of his tournament run, that's the guy. Like they're not going to have the Dante DiVincenzo effect, or I guess
which was
like Jordan Hawkins. Yeah. Jordan Hawkins is going to take that kind of rise that DiVincenzo had for winning a championship. But I don't think Miller's going to have one of those ones where, okay, it was so bad that we're going to, drop him from potentially 3 to 7. I don't even think he gets out of the top 4.
Okay. Now, I'm interested, Leaf, because I feel like consensus preseason, people probably didn't have him as high as 4 as you did. Would you say that's fair from your memory of other folks' preseason big boards? And then on top of that, why is it that you had him so high when others didn't?
I think he was mostly regarded as about the 10th kind of pick, someone that could go from 8 to 14. The reason that I liked him as a prospect so much is I thought he reminded me a little bit of Jason Tatum and Paolo Banchero. And I'm not saying entirely as players, but in what I perceived to be their weakness was really a strength. And I'll elaborate on that. Basically, if you look at the scouting reports for both Paolo Banchero and Jason Tatum coming out of Duke, shot selection was the glaring weakness. You were like, my goodness, what could he do if he didn't shoot these terrible shots? Well, I decided to perceive it as they can do these terrible shots. Like they shoot these shots that you wouldn't want them to take, but they have the facilities to do so. And they're shot makers. And if all you have to do is take better ones, and because you have the capacity to make those bad ones, imagine taking the good ones. And so that's why I had Banchero number 1 last year. I had Jason Tatum above above Markelle Fultz. And I think I had him above Lonzo Ball. Granted, at that point, I was 16 years old, so I don't remember. But the overarching point of that is I thought the NBA is transitioning to more and more people who handle the ball that are bigger and create their own shots via creating separation through isolation as opposed to running off the ball. And so guys like Nick Smith Jr. And Jarace Walker, I thought Nick Smith gets to the paint and shoots floaters, and I didn't love that even against high school athletes, he wasn't the superior finisher himself. Like he was a better athlete than his competition, but not by the amount that you want your top 5 pick to be. Jarace Walker played in a system at IMG where he didn't get the ball a ton. So I think there was context. And like I said, I might have just gotten lucky. I watched him play a game, right, and I was like, man, this guy's really mature. He knows how to play. And a lot of people didn't like the fact he was older. And I've never really regarded that as something that I dislike for a prospect. Like they can't control their age. Like, sure, it can be a positive, but it also shouldn't be a glaring negative just because he was 20 basically most of the freshman season. I watch him play basketball and I say, relative to the competition, he's dominant. And that was kind of my perception.
Leaf, I'd be remiss not to ask you because people are going to be curious about it. Everything surrounding Alabama and the things that came out about the murder and the gun down the stretch, and Brandon Miller being the one to ultimately knowingly or unknowingly deliver that gun. I asked about his NCAA tournament performance affecting his draft stock. Obviously, teams are going to ask him about this, right? And is that going to come into play in terms of draft stock at all?
I don't think unless anything new comes out, like that is, incriminating. I don't think so. Granted, he's going to have to deal with that question the rest of his life, not
That's
just
right.
in these draft processes. But the fact that he was able to play for not only once it came out, he was still able to play, but he was able to play after it happened till when it came out, and he was, cooperating. I think that they're just going to take his play at face value, and maybe even some teams might like the fact that he was able to deal with adversity for the most part well, even though he had a poor tournament. And that may be like, hey, you know what? He had to deal with this surrounding adversity. So, like, we'll give him a slide or a pass for the lack of production relative to his ability in the tournament. So, to answer that question, I think he's going to have to answer that question forever. I think that there could be teams that don't like it and have to decide on his character, but he's too talented of a basketball player, strictly on the basketball court, to slip out of the top 5.
Yeah. So teams are ultimately going to be deciding who is this kid really and what's he all about. Clearly the basketball skills are all there. Last thing, Leaf, you've mentioned a couple really big names in the same conversation here as Brandon Miller: Paul George, Jason Tatum, Paolo Banchero. Would one of those guys be your strongest comp for Brandon Miller, or would you go with somebody else?
This is an interesting one. I came up with this. There's a guy named Tony Jones who writes for the Jazz that I play pickup with. Again, he loves the draft and he's very knowledgeable basketball. So I watched Brandon Miller and randomly started talking to him, and he's like, "Man, he's Paul George." And this was the day I watched him, so I rewatched it and I was like, "Man, he moves like Paul George." I don't think he's the uber athlete that Paul George is.
Gotcha.
So I'll say this. I think Paul George was, like, people forget how athletic Paul George was in Indiana prior to the injury. He's still a very good athlete, but he was a freak show athlete back in Indiana. So I think he's a combination of Paul George and Danny Granger. So two Indiana wings. He's got a little more of the guile that Granger has and some more of the athleticism that George has. He's just not quite the athlete that Paul George was.
Will he play the 3 in the NBA?
I think he can play the 3 and the 4. I think he's better suited as the 3. But there's going to be teams where they ask him, "Hey, you want to play the 4 and get a few more rebounds? Play a little more physically and use your height to take advantage of kind of slower defenders." So combination forward. It's positionless or trending toward it.
Sure, exactly. And so it'll be roster dependent, or are we playing small or big, any of that kind of stuff, and he can float between the two. Love it. Leaf, there we go. Our first NBA draft prospect conversation of this offseason, Mr. Brandon Miller, whom we expect to see go very early in the 23 NBA draft. As I alluded to earlier, it's time for a little bit of a Charles Dickens conversation. It's a tale of two teams, and we'll bring that to you in just a second. But first, this episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA playoffs are almost here, and now's the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because brand new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. Safe, secure, super easy to use. And then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scores, anything else. Make sure to check out some of the NBA action going on today. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same game parlay. So don't miss the chance to get your no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/locked on. Once again, that's FanDuel.com/locked on to learn all about it. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA that we just talked about. Love that. So, Leaf, a tale of two teams, if you will allow me that tale of two cities analogy. Both started the season unranked. Both started the season in others receiving votes. By week 7, they were the top two teams in the AP poll. One got a questionable 1 seed, the other a questionable 4 seed. In the end, one was for real, the other not so much. But here's the thing. We knew it all along. Who are they? That 4 seed, your national champion UConn Huskies, who should have been higher seeded, and the other, the second ever 1 seed to lose to a 16, the Purdue Boilermakers, that should have been a 2 seed. Leaf, what is it about these two teams that indicated that one was a contender and one a pretender? And let me go ahead and give the good people the receipts so they know that we are not lying when we say we knew this all along. You tweeted, my friend, on October 17th, almost a full month before the season started, teams I'm higher on than the AP poll, other than the ones in my top 5. San Diego State, way to go there. We're not even talking about them, but yeah, national championship contestant. UConn, the other team in the national championship game. Well done on your first two. And then Florida, we'll just pass that one on by because Todd Golden, they'll get it right in year 2.
In my defense, Castleton got hurt.
That's right. That does not help the cause. Like, I was in on UConn when they jumped up the first time, but not all the way back in freaking October. Leaf, you're doing work. And also, folks, you can go back and check the earlier episodes of this show. Leaf has been out on Purdue all along. So, Leaf, what is it about these two teams that made you realize that even though they had the same trajectory from unranked to the top of the poll, that you knew that UConn was legit and Purdue was not? What showed that?
Well, I'll start with UConn. UConn, when I look at a poll, I hardly pay attention to where anyone else ranks it, just because it's all random guessing. And I got lucky. The San Diego State one, I didn't even remember. I said the only reason I found that receipt is I was talking with my friends. I was like, I swear I said UConn's one of the best teams in the country early in the season, like before the season started. My friend was like, no, you didn't. And I was like, I really thought I did. So I was searching for a while. And there you go. You found the receipt and dug it up. But I was stunned to see San Diego State there. I remember the thought process. So UConn, I last year liked UConn's team a lot. And one game in particular stood out to me of UConn's season the whole year. And all year last year, I thought they were an Elite 8 caliber team because they had veteran guards in RJ Cole and Tyrese Martin, because they had a kind of burdening star in Adama Sanogo who can play in the front court. And they had this one kid, he's skinny, but he could really shoot the ball off the bench. And they played against Walker Kessler and Jabari Smith and Auburn, who got up to number 1 in the country and beat them. And this kid that came off the bench from DeMatha High School was shooting the lights out and had a critical error. So I told myself, I was like, man, I'm going to keep tabs on him. Hardly played. His name now Jordan Hawkins, and he's going to be a top 20 player. So long story short, and this is truly how I came to this conclusion of UConn being a team that I would rank. I think I found my AP poll that I made on that date, October 17th. And I had UConn at number 10, tied with someone else that my phone just died. But they were number 10 or 11, however which way you want to put it. And San Diego State was 16th on there. And San Diego State was somewhere around there in the poll. UConn was unranked. Purdue was somewhere later in the poll. But UConn, I remembered Adama Sanogo, Big East Player of the Year preseason. Everyone knew he was going to be good. So no clairvoyance there. If there was Andre Jackson's long been one of my favorite players in college basketball. So perhaps a bit of bias helped me in this. And then I looked at who they added. What do they need around Adama Sanogo? And they needed a guy to replace RJ Cole, and they brought in Tristan Newton, not my favorite, but the point guard really was Andre Jackson. And then they added a stretch forward and Alex Caravan, who actually was helped by Samson Johnson hurting his foot in the first game.
Yeah.
But I read a lot of articles about Alex Caravan being the player of the year in, I believe, New Hampshire. And I was like, you know what, I'll buy this. And man, Naeem Alen, now they're going to add another veteran backup guard, Hassan Diarra. Depth team, a team that underperformed last year and had a guy that was exploding in Adama Sanogo and Jordan Hawkins, who I really, really bought. I bought all the stock available in those two. So it looks good now. As for Purdue, and this will be a little more succinct, I didn't think they were going to be very good entering the year. I kind of, out of respect for Matt Painter, put him as like 24, 25, because at that point you just don't know what you're getting.
Yeah, right.
And I knew Edey was going to be good. Like, he's going to be good. I thought their second best player was going to be Brandon Newman, who entered the transfer portal today, ironically enough. But Newman, and then they didn't start him at the beginning of the year. They started 2 unknown freshmen that are diminutive in size. And I was like, oh man, I just can't imagine they'll be very good. They dominated early in the year, got up to number 1. But all along, they had a common flaw. It's that they didn't shoot well, even though they were getting unbelievable looks, and their guards weren't individually able to create for themselves, which is what you have to be able to do. Hence why Tristan Newton scoring 19 in a championship was important. Even though I didn't love him as a point guard in terms of playmaking responsibilities, he could score. Jordan Hawkins shoots the lights out, can score. They didn't have guards that could score on their own, and they're so reliant. Everything ran through Zach Edey. Everything was a post touch, swing out. So they ran beautiful offense, but it was unsustainable, especially when you shoot sub 31% from three, as they turned out to do. So they would have had to shoot 38% or something to be true contenders, in my opinion, and that was never going to happen. But that's the logic. UConn one, I really was strong about. Purdue, I think they overachieved, even though they lost in the first round. Like, believe it or not, that's a team that wasn't supposed to be a top 10 team, much less the number one team in the country for much of the year. But because of they were who they really were, hurt them because they had exceeded expectations all the rest of the year, got a number one seed, and then lost early in the tournament. Maybe earlier than we all foresaw, but early. I think most of us, I'd imagine, I listened to your podcast, but it's been a long time. I think you took Memphis to beat Purdue as well, right?
That's right.
I did as well. So we were in the same vein of thought there.
Man, it's just so interesting because, when two teams follow an unranked to all the way up trajectory like this, you would just think like, oh, well, everyone just missed and they're legit and awesome. But man, I just think while the UConn guards weren't necessary, I don't think I would call them elite this year in terms of like some of the other teams. They were certainly much closer to elite than the Purdue two unheralded freshman guards who, as you said, overachieved for themselves, but it was bound to come down at some point. At some point, the Zach Edey of it all wasn't like he can't feed himself in the post. And while the UConn guys are able to help Sonogo and help Klingon more to be a more fully well-rounded team, and Purdue just didn't ever seem to have those parts. They needed more shooting. They needed more athleticism surrounding all that. And frankly, they needed not two freshmen in the backcourt, Leaf.
Yeah, and I thought those guards played well. It's like it's hard. You have to be spectacular to be 5'11" and 6'3" as true freshmen, much less in general, but just as true freshmen to create for yourself. And especially at 18 years old, I really find it difficult to believe that they were going to have ancillary scoring. They had one source of scoring, and you needed to hit wide open threes at a really high clip to contend. And I mean, quite frankly, I think Brandon Newman should have been their second best player, and he should have been their second, the guy who was able to create for himself as a secondary piece. But he never really was that. He became more of a defender and a glue guy along with Ethan Morton. And you can only have so many of those guys. You need to have guys that can put the ball in the hole alongside your 7'4" behemoth who swept the National Player of the Year awards, and deservingly so. It's just it's an unsustainable recipe.
It's been a really interesting thing to watch. I'm very curious to see, and these are conversations we'll have to have this offseason, but who is next year's UConn and who's next year's Purdue, right? Like that'll be a very interesting conversation to watch. And also who's next year's UNC that starts flip-flop like at the top and just craters themselves. So really interesting stuff. Leaf, I love that you were in on this from the beginning. Going to be really fun to watch what happens with both these teams this offseason, who comes back, because both of them can get just about everyone back. Obviously, Jordan Hawkins should be gone, but outside of that, I could see just about anybody coming back. So we'll obviously keep a lot of tabs on that. Leaf, that upset to Purdue, a lot of other upsets around the place. We missed a lot of the matchups we were hoping for. And so after a phenomenal first round of TV ratings, we just learned that the national championship game was the lowest rated in terms of viewership national championship game on record. What on earth happened? We'll talk about that in just a second. All right, Leaf Tulane. The first round of the NCAA tournament was wacky. We had stuff happen all over the place. We just talked about Purdue becoming the second ever 16 seed to lose to got that backwards. Second ever 1 seed to lose to a 16. We had another 15 over a 2. All sorts of greatness happening. And it led to a record 9.2 million average for the viewership of the round of 64. We started there at the mountaintop. The problem is that a lot of years, those Cinderellas start to filter their way out as the Blue Bloods rise to the top in the second weekend and beyond. That didn't happen this year. And then that leads us to we had last year's Final Four. That was an absolute dream for TV execs. We had 3 of the bluest blue bloods in the nation, and one that is, if they're not already a blue blood, they should be there at some point in the next decade or two. That's Villanova, who joined Kansas, North Carolina, and Duke. And then this year, you have this starkly different Final Four with the 2 national champion competitors. Obviously, UConn is kind of a blue blood. Some are saying they're now, or excuse me, a new blood. Some are saying now that they're a blue blood, but San Diego State, Florida Atlantic, and Miami along with that. And what does that lead to? We go from the most viewed round of 64 to the lowest viewed final national championship on record, 14.69 million viewers average. The previous low was the 2018 national championship, Villanova over Michigan, 15.99 million average viewers. Leaf, is this a problem for our sport of college basketball, where those of us who love the game are all in on whatever happens, whether it's all sorts of upsets in the Final Four, like new teams that no one expects, whether it's the Blue Buds, whomever, versus Johnny Q basketball fan who is probably not going to tune in if we don't get around to the national brands by the Final Four? Is that the issue at play here?
Yeah, I think that at a certain point, brand names sell. Like, I mean, when you get Duke and Carolina, there's no better script than you can write for the Final Four. Like Kansas and Villanova on the other side was certainly something, but like Duke and Carolina are the 2 bigger brands that at least pertinence like right now, and their rivals. So I'm sure, I don't have the stats in front of me, but I'm sure they out viewershipped the other side of that. So of course, this year when you get plucky underdogs, it's awesome early because you want drama, you want the best narrative possible, and that's what the narrative became. But at a certain point, like you said, the cream usually rises to the top, and it didn't this year in terms of the top teams winning or the perceived to be top teams winning. But I would argue this year was a year where it was primed to happen. There was no dominant teams.
That's right.
And it makes it hard for the cream to rise to the top if there's no, cream. Like I don't think there was a team that was going to be. Is it a problem? The problem that people perceive it to be is that college basketball has got an imperfect way of crowning the best team. But my problem is people who say that, because college basketball has got the best, unequivocally the best way of deciding the champion, because there's no better weekend than when you go into the first 4 days and every single day you're glued to your phone, your couch, your computer, your TV, everything, and you're just hanging on the seat of your pants waiting for an upset. I don't like the playoffs. You rarely ever get an upset in NBA, and it's awesome basketball, and it may crown the best team more accurately, but it's never as entertaining. And so I think the problem is people being snobby about it, wanting the top teams more so than it being, a problem that the top teams didn't get there this year.
I grabbed the numbers while you were talking, and you're spot on. The UNC Duke semifinal last year was 18.5 million. The UNC Kansas National Championship, 18.1. So yeah, that UNC Duke semifinal was well above either of those championship games we just talked about. And interestingly, on the other side of things, Leaf, we had the highest viewership ever in the women's Final Four and national championship. And some of that was the brand names on the front of the shirt, but I think a lot of it was about the names on the back of the shirt, because we had Aaliyah Boston against Caitlin Clark and Caitlin Clark against Angel Reese, right? Like we had all this stuff that drew all the eyeballs. And so whether it's front name or back name brand names, it seems like in order to maintain the most eyeballs watching this thing, we got to have those brand names, as you were talking about.
And I think NIL is something you were alluding to there with the women's game, where the top players had their teams in the championships, and that wasn't as prevalent in the men's game this year. Real quickly, no one's complained that a team that was 36-0 in South Carolina entering the Final Four didn't win. I mean, that's the whole complaint for people who've been bashing the NCAA tournament, is that the Alabamas of the world didn't win. And it was a team like UConn, who was a 4 seed, even though that was wrongly seeded.
As we said earlier, yeah.
Yeah. And anyone who watched college basketball all year knew that. Like we talked early in this year how they could be the best team in the country, like one of our first episodes.
That's right.
And so my point being is no one's had a gripe about that, because the star player in Caitlin Clark was the one to beat them. Like, had Marquise Noel, who is the most equivalent to Caitlin Clark, I'm not saying they're comparable
that's
in terms of their own game. Like, Caitlin Clark is the better player in her game than what Marquise Noel is in his game. But he was the star of the tournament. Had he made it, I don't think there'd be as big of a gripe as there was about not crowning the right victor, because LSU was a 3 seed in the women's game and they won. No one's complaining about that. They were just like, South Carolina was 36-0 and didn't win. No one said, oh, inaccurate, like the victor was inaccurate. Like, it only happens because the men's game didn't get the eyeballs, because there weren't brand names. Because of the NIL and the awesome players on the women's side that headlined it, I think people were happy. The men's game just didn't have the guy to cling to, or a team to cling to, as they typically do.
And the drama of the women's side of things, with all the Cena stuff and the Clark versus Reese of it all, I think that helped played into it. So I love those points, Leaf, and we're going to have to watch the numbers and versus the teams and players who were in it. You know, like, do we have our Brandon Millers? Do we have our whomever? Like, if Zion was in the NIL era, right? Like, any of that would have done massive numbers. So we're going to have to keep our eyes on that in future years. Regardless, folks, what a beautiful tournament it is. Leaf is right on. It is the best thing going in sports. What a great episode. Great opportunity to be back together. Leaf, so great to have you back on the show, folks. Andy will be back with you on tomorrow's show, talking some Big East stuff with our guy, Matt St. John. As always, please don't forget to subscribe to the show, smash the like button, and leave some comments on your thoughts on the show. Want to apologize to the lawyer family. Go Wildcats. And until tomorrow, peace.